After Mom's funeral, relatives place Boy out of her house. Years later, this happens. The rain poured relentlessly that afternoon, as if the heavens themselves were mourning her loss. It had been a week since the boy's mother had passed away, and the house, once filled with her laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty. For 12-year-old Daniel, life as he knew it had crumbled in an instant. He sat quietly on the worn sofa, clutching an old photograph of his mother, the only source of comfort left in a world that suddenly felt unrecognizable. The funeral had been a blur of tears and condolences from distant relatives who spoke of his mother as if they truly knew her. Yet, as the days passed, their kind words seemed to fade, replaced by hushed conversations and glances that hinted at decisions being made without him. Daniel didn't understand it at first, but the truth would soon hit him like a storm. He was no longer welcome in the house he had always called home. The day the relatives made their move was one Daniel would never forget. His mother's older brother, Uncle Raymond, stood in the doorway, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the small boy. "It's for the best," Raymond said, his voice firm but devoid of emotion. "You can't stay here anymore. This house needs to be sold, and well, we've arranged for you to stay with your aunt." Daniel's heart sank. He wanted to protest, to scream that this was his home, the place where his mother had raised him, where every corner held memories of her love and care. But his words caught in his throat, and all he could do was nod silently. A few hours later, a small bag of his belongings was packed, and he was sent off to live with Aunt Margaret, a woman he barely knew. Margaret's house was nothing like the home he had left behind. It was cold and unwelcoming, with rules that seemed to exist solely to make him feel like a burden. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't kind either. To her, Daniel was just another responsibility, a duty she had reluctantly agreed to. The warmth of family that he had once known was replaced by a sense of isolation that grew heavier with each passing day. As years went by, Daniel learned to adapt. He kept his head down, worked hard in school, and avoided drawing attention to himself. Yet, no matter how much he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider, a guest in a life that wasn't truly his. He often thought of his mother, wondering what she would say if she could see him now. Would she be proud of how he was holding up? Or would she weep for the childhood he had lost? But life, as it often does, had a way of turning the unexpected into the extraordinary. What Daniel didn't know was that the pain and challenges he endured were quietly shaping him into someone far stronger than he realized. While his relatives had written him off as a forgotten part of the family, Daniel was busy building a future no one could have predicted. Years later, when Daniel returned to the small town he had once called home, everything had changed. The streets seemed smaller, the faces less familiar. But Daniel was no longer the timid boy who had been forced out of his mother's house. He was a man with a purpose, driven by a deep desire to honor the memory of the woman who had loved him unconditionally. And as he stepped out of his car and onto the driveway of the very house he had been taken from all those years ago, one thought echoed in his mind. This is where it all began, and this is where it will change. What happened next would leave everyone speechless, including the very relatives who had once cast him aside. Daniel stood at the edge of the driveway, his gaze fixed on the house he had once called home. It looked almost the same as he remembered, but time had added its touch, peeling paint on the shutters, an overgrown lawn, and a faint air of neglect. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was more than just a visit. It was a moment he had played out in his mind for years. As he approached the front door, memories came rushing back. His mother singing in the kitchen, the smell of her favorite lavender candles, the sound of her laughter that used to fill the halls. This house wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of everything he had lost. Yet standing here now, he wasn't the scared boy who had been pushed out with a hastily packed bag. He was someone who had fought to rebuild his life from the ground up. The door opened before he could knock. A man in his 60s, frail but familiar, stood there, his expression caught between surprise and discomfort. It was Uncle Raymond. His once imposing presence seemed diminished now, but Daniel felt no satisfaction in seeing him this way. "Daniel." Raymond's voice wavered, as if he wasn't sure whether to believe his own eyes. "It's me," Daniel replied simply, his tone steady but firm. There was an awkward pause before Raymond stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. The house felt smaller inside, almost suffocating. The walls, once adorned with family photos, were bare, and the furniture looked worn and tired. The life that had once thrived here was long gone. Raymond cleared his throat. "I didn't expect, it's been years." "What brings you back?" Daniel looked around, his eyes lingering on the empty spaces where his mother's presence had once been so strong. "I came back to see what's left, to see if this place still feels like home." Raymond shifted uncomfortably. "The house has been in and out of our hands since you left. It's barely standing now." "I doubt it's worth much." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He wasn't here for small talk. He needed answers. Answers to questions he had carried with him for years. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with pain. "Why did you send me away? Was it really about the house, or was there more to it?" Raymond's face fell, and for a moment, he looked like he might avoid the question. But then he sighed deeply and sat down, gesturing for Daniel to do the same. "It wasn't just about the house," he admitted, his voice low. "After your mom passed, everything fell apart. The debts, the legal issues, it was overwhelming. We thought we were doing what was best for you, sending you to Margaret. We thought you'd be better off." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "Better off? I was a kid, and you took away everything I knew, everything I loved. You didn't even ask me what I wanted." Raymond looked down, his guilt evident. "You're right. We should have done things differently. But at the time, we were all grieving, and none of us knew how to handle it. I'm sorry, Daniel. I truly am." The apology hung in the air, but it wasn't enough to erase the years of pain. Daniel knew there was no going back, but there was something else driving him now, something bigger than anger or resentment. "I didn't come here to dredge up the past," he said finally. "I came here to make things right." Raymond frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel stood, his posture strong and confident. "This house, my mother's house, means something to me. It's where my life started, and it's where I want to build something new. I've been saving for years, working harder than I ever thought I could. I'm buying this house back, Raymond, and I'm going to restore it." Raymond stared at him, stunned. "You're serious? After everything that happened, you still want this place?" "Yes," Daniel said firmly, "because it's more than just a house. It's a part of her, and no one else will ever understand that the way I do." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel navigated the legal process with a determination that left no room for doubt. Along the way, he uncovered more about the house's history, hidden debts, neglected repairs, and stories from neighbors who remembered his mother fondly. Each discovery only strengthened his resolve. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some of his relatives, including Aunt Margaret, resurfaced with objections. They claimed a stake in the property, insisting that they deserved a share. It felt like history repeating itself, and Daniel found himself at the center of a new battle over the place he had fought so hard to reclaim. Still, he refused to back down. Every sleepless night, every heated argument, only fueled his determination. He wasn't just fighting for the house. He was fighting for the life his mother had wanted for him, the one she had worked so hard to provide. And through it all, he never lost sight of his goal: to honor her memory and create a legacy that would endure. As the days turned into weeks, the tension reached its peak. Daniel's future and the fate of the house hung in the balance, and everyone was watching to see how it would all unfold. The legal process stretched on longer than Daniel had hoped, and with every delay, the tension grew. Family gatherings turned into silent standoffs, with relatives exchanging glances filled with judgment and greed. Aunt Margaret, in particular, made it clear that she saw Daniel's efforts as a waste of time. Why pour everything you have into something that's falling apart? She scoffed during one heated exchange. Daniel didn't flinch. Because this isn't just about the house. It's about what it stands for. It's about her. His voice carried a weight that silenced even Margaret. Still, the battle wasn't easy. The financial strain, coupled with the emotional toll of reliving his past, was almost too much to bear. But just when Daniel felt he was at his breaking point, an unexpected ally stepped forward. It was Mrs. Hargrove, an elderly neighbor who had lived next door to his mother for decades. She had always been kind to Daniel when he was a boy, offering him cookies and listening to his stories about school. Now she brought him a box of old photos and letters that his mother had entrusted to her years ago. "These belong to you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your mother always talked about how proud she was of you. She wanted you to have these someday." Inside the box were snapshots of his childhood, letters his mother had written but never sent, and even a small notebook filled with her dreams for their future. As Daniel flipped through the pages, he found an entry that stopped him in his tracks. It was a list of things his mother had hoped to do with the house, repairs she wanted to make, flowers she planned to plant in the garden, and notes about how she wanted it to be a place filled with love and laughter. It was exactly the motivation Daniel needed. With renewed determination, he pushed forward. He worked tirelessly, negotiating with the bank, gathering the funds, and proving his right to reclaim the house. Meanwhile, he started clearing out the property, pulling weeds, fixing broken windows, and removing years of neglect. The process was grueling, but every nail hammered and every wall painted brought him closer to fulfilling his mother's dream. The turning point came when the final paperwork was approved. The house was his again, free and clear. Standing in the empty living room, Daniel felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: relief, pride, and a bittersweet ache for the woman who had made it all possible. The next few months were a labor of love. Daniel poured his heart into restoring the house, guided by his mother's handwritten notes. He painted the walls her favorite soft yellow, planted the garden she had envisioned, and filled the space with small touches that reminded him of her warmth. Neighbors who had once known his mother stopped by to lend a hand, sharing stories about her kindness and generosity. The house, once a symbol of loss, began to feel alive again. The day of the housewarming arrived, and Daniel invited everyone who had played a role in his journey. Even Aunt Margaret and Uncle Raymond came, albeit reluctantly. As the guests walked through the house, marveling at its transformation, Daniel stood by the front door, watching their reactions. "This is incredible," Raymond finally admitted, his voice soft. "Your mother would be so proud." Daniel nodded, his heart full. "She gave me everything, even when she had so little. This house was her dream, and now it's my way of keeping her memory alive." As the sun set, the guests gathered in the backyard, where Daniel had created a small garden in his mother's honor. A stone plaque in the center read, "In loving memory of Sarah, whose love made this house a home." For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of peace. The boy who had been pushed out of his mother's house had returned, not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who had turned his pain into purpose. The house was no longer just a reminder of what he had lost. It was a testament to the strength, love, and resilience his mother had instilled in him. As the evening wore on and the laughter of his guests filled the air, Daniel sat quietly on the porch, looking out at the world he had rebuilt. He didn't need anyone's approval or recognition. He had found what he was searching for all along, a place to call home.